For today's training, we ask that you submit any questions you may have via the Q&A feature, which may be located on the toolbar of your Zoom screen. This helps our team ensure that your questions are not missed, and in some cases determine if a help desk ticket is needed for further support. So thank you for your understanding. For today's training, you'll have two moderators from the HMIS help desk. Michaela will be providing a review of the uses and disclosures of client information, privacy best practices, and HMIS data elements concerning client profile and demographic data. And I'll be providing an in-depth review of the prior living situation data element, followed by a Q&A session. We'll also host an anonymous poll at the end of our meeting, and we would greatly appreciate your participation with that. Please note again that today's training is being recorded, and all meeting materials, as well as the recording, will be made available on the HMIS website under the Meetings dropdown. And with that, let's dive in.
Before we get started, I wanted to share some context to build our foundation around collecting and entering data elements and the corresponding language to describe when to collect data, from whom, and where they should be recorded. This terminology is used by HUD to organize information about each data element for the HUD data standards, which ensures consistency, clarity, and accurate reporting across all HMIS projects. Data elements. Response fields in HMIS correlate to categories of data called elements. For example, universal data elements such as name or social security number. Client universe. Which group of clients is the data about? Example, all clients, head of household, veterans, or etc. Collection point. What point in time the data element is entered? For example, record creation, enrollment screen, exit screen, or occurrence point. Universal data elements. Universal data elements are data required to be collected by all projects about all clients participating in HMIS, regardless of funding source, to produce unduplicated estimates of the number of people experiencing homelessness and accessing services. Provide context about the basic demographic characteristics of people experiencing homelessness, including patterns of service use, shelter stays, and homelessness over time. Universal data elements are found on the client profile and project enrollment and exit screens. During this section, we'll review appropriate uses and disclosures of client information. Using and disclosing client information. As noted in the HMIS data standards, the clients always have the right to privacy and can refuse to provide their information without being denied service. However, some information may be required to determine program eligibility. That said, when asking for this information, it's important to explain why it's needed and document if a client chooses to provide a response or prefers not to answer. Clients can give, refuse, or revoke consent at any time, and those decisions must always be respected and recorded in HMIS. Client consent is not needed to ask for the information or to enter it into HMIS. Some funders may establish required data elements that agencies will need to ask client for specific information and to enter it into HMIS. Please note, however, that collecting the data and using or disclosing the data are two different things. For additional guidance, staff should refer to the HMIS client record sharing decision pathways and related knowledge-based articles, including the release of information page and how to document refusal or revoke consent. Overall, our goal is to be transparent and respectful while ensuring accurate data collection. In our next section, we'll cover client privacy best practices including the use of the HMIS client privacy forms for informed consent, and the explanation of client rights regarding how their data is shared. All HMIS users must be able to clearly explain the purpose and benefit of HMIS and the related HMIS consent form as detailed in the client privacy section. What is HMIS? What personal identifying data will be collected and how will it be used? Privacy and confidentiality standards, revocation of consent and how to do it. Ensure clients have the opportunity to review and ask questions about each of their privacy forms during intake. Remind clients that they have the right to deny or revoke their consent at any time and that their decision is to share the personal protected information and it will not affect their ability to receive most services. Most services that do not require certain data for program eligibility. An example when specific data is needed for eligibility verification is a permanent supportive housing project that may require information about disabilities or a program required to serve only elderly individuals. They may require a date of birth to ensure the individual is over 62. HUD Data Elements 3.01 to 3.07, Client Profile and Demographic Data. 3.01, Name. Before creating a new profile, search if the client already has an existing HMIS record to reduce duplicate records. If the client does not yet have an HMIS record, create a new client record, enter the client's full name, and select the appropriate data quality indicator. Use the name the client identifies with unless a funder requires the legal name. This helps prevent duplicate records and makes searches easier. Street outreach and coordinated entry projects may record limited information about the client and improve the accuracy and completeness of client data over time by editing the data. For more information on client profiles, please review the Adding Client Profiles to HMIS Knowledge Base article. When creating client records, users are required to enter a response for the quality of name field. Whenever possible, record the client's full first and last name as completely and accurately as provided. A client's preferred name may be used in place of their legal name unless the legal name is required by a funder. Users must select the appropriate quality of name response to indicate whether the name entered reflects the client's full and accurate name or a partial street or code name used for temporary or security purposes. For certain projects, it is expected that some clients may not be ready to disclose personal information at the time of intake. Users should be careful to only use the client doesn't know option when client doesn't know their name or are unable to provide their name. If the client does not want to provide their name, the user would select client prefers not to answer. If the user did not attempt to collect the client's name, select data not collected. If the staff member creates a made-up placeholder name, such as blue hat or gray beard, then one of the above options should be selected because the client did not provide that name. Name collection best practices. Always search for existing client records before creating a new record. Validate any potential records with the client's other PPI, examples date of birth or social security number, especially if the name given is a fairly common name. Use the client's preferred name, spelling, and format provided by the client unless a complete legal name is required by the funder. Have the client review the name information entered for accuracy. If needed, update or correct temporary or incomplete name data when the more accurate data becomes available. Collecting primary identification to validate the client data entered on the profile screen should be a priority. Name collection common errors. Entering a legal name when the client identifies with a different name when the legal name is not required by the funder. Not verifying the existing name when a client already has a record in HMIS. In this example, a client record was initially created with the spelling error spelling GELDALF with an E instead of an A. If I had searched only by the client's name, this time using the correct spelling, I would have missed the existing record with the incorrect spelling. To prevent this, it is recommended to search by the client's date of birth or social security number, if available, to find possible existing records, especially if the name is fairly common. Another common error is to create a record using a nickname or a code provided by the client and failing to update the record when the client shares their real or preferred name. The same error can occur when staff create a placeholder name when the client is not initially known or provided by the client. 3.02 Social Security Number. Collection of Social Security numbers, or SSN, are used for the unique identification of each person served and to avoid creating duplicate records at the project start. While PATH, COC, and ESG funded projects are only required to collect the last 4 digits of the Social Security number, staff should strive to collect all 9 digits of the Social Security number. The Social Security number field appears at the top of the client record creation screen. A Social Security entry and quality of SSN response is required before you can save a new client record. If left blank, the system displays a banner to indicate that the record cannot be saved. For more information on Social Security number data entry, please review our knowledge base article, Adding Client Profiles to HMIS. When a user enters a Social Security number for a client, the system will check to see if the Social Security number is valid based on Social Security Administration guidelines. If the SSN does not conform with SSA guidelines, Clarity will give the user a soft warning. The user can change the entries or save. If the user clicks cancel, the pop-up disappears. The user's mouse returns to the first digit of the Social Security number. The Social Security number field is underlined in red, and the user can change the Social Security number and save the profile with the edited SSN. If the user enters another invalid SSN, the pop-up appears again. This continues until a valid Social Security number or one with 1 through 9 non-numerical digits or characters are entered. Note that if the user clicks OK, the pop-up disappears and the Social Security number field is not underlined in red. This user can save the profile with the invalid Social Security number. When completing the Social Security number field, users may also enter non-numeric digits for parts of the Social Security number that are unknown or refused by a client. The system will automatically convert those non-numeric entries to an X. If any digit in the Social Security number has a non-numeric character, the quality of Social Security number field defaults to approximate or partial Social Security number reported. However, if a non-numeric character is entered for all 9 digits of the Social Security number, the quality of the Social Security number field defaults to client doesn't know. Users must edit the appropriate quality of Social Security number to reflect the outcome of the data collection. Client prefers not to answer. A client prefers not to provide any part of their Social Security number, regardless of the reason, or data not collected. No attempt was made to collect a Social Security number for the client. Social Security number collection best practices. Collecting the full Social Security number when possible. Verifying and collecting or correcting existing Social Security numbers in HMIS with primary documentation when entering partial Social Security numbers. If the full number is unavailable, updating records when a new, more accurate and complete information is obtained. and cross-checking client social security numbers with identifiers to prevent duplicate client records. Social security number common errors. Failing to check whether the social security number already in the client's HMIS record is correct when enrolling them. Typing errors or entering numbers without confirming accuracy with the client. Changing a previously recorded full 9-digit social security number to only the last 4 digits when the client did not request it. Not documenting whether the client refused, does not know, or if the social security number was not collected. Not using a SSN along with the name and date of birth to check if the client already exists in HMIS. Entering only the last 4 digits initially and never updating the record when the full social security number becomes available. And using numbers like 999999999 instead of properly selecting the correct social security data quality option. 3.03 Date of birth. Date of birth is collected to help determine a client's age at a project start and during enrollment and to support the accurate identification of each person served in HMIS. Collecting a full and accurate date of birth helps prevent duplicate records and improves overall data quality. The client date of birth field is located on the client record creation screen under the social security number and name fields. When completing the date of birth and quality of date of birth fields, users will find the following response options. Full date of birth reported. Select when the client can provide the day, month, and year of their date of birth. Approximate or partial date of birth reported. Select when the client cannot provide the day or the month of their date of birth. Client prefers not to answer. Select when the client declines to provide their birth year. Data not collected. Select when the client was not asked for their date of birth. And client doesn't know. If the client did not know their date of birth within 1 year. Collection best practices. Staff should strive to obtain primary documentation, such as a birth certificate, ID, or other documents to validate the date of birth provided by the client. If a record already exists for the client, verify that the recorded date of birth is accurate. In both cases, the client should be allowed to review and confirm the accuracy of the date of birth used for the record. In cases where the client doesn't remember the day or the month of their date of birth, users should record 1 in place of the missing information. The Clarity system will auto-populate approximate or partial date of birth reported. Date of birth common errors. Entering an incorrect date of birth, sometimes due to typing errors. Failing to check and confirm the accuracy of the date of birth provided when using an existing record. Using an estimated date of birth but not marking it as approximate. Choosing client doesn't know or client prefers not to answer when the full date of birth was provided. And entering a placeholder date of birth or guessing a client's age without asking them or reviewing documentation. Race and ethnicity. Race and ethnicity is used to indicate client self-identification with one or more different racial and/or ethnic categories. The data supports system planning and local and national understanding of who is experiencing homelessness. Clients may self-report as many race and ethnicity responses as needed. Additional race and ethnicity detail, which is optional, is available to capture options not available in the pick list. Staff can write in client self-reported additional race and ethnicity detail. A full list of race and ethnicity response options and descriptions are available from the HMIS Data Standards Manual. If the client does not know their race or ethnicity, enter client doesn't know. If the client does not want to provide the information, enter client prefers not to answer. A response of data not collected means the client was not asked about their race or ethnicity. Race and ethnicity collection best practices. Always collect race and ethnicity through client self-identification. Do not rely on staff observation or assumptions based on appearance, name, or background. Show the client all race and ethnicity response options. Allow the client to select multiple races or ethnicities if they identify with more than one. Ask questions in a respectful and non-judgmental way. Be aware that past experiences or trauma may affect a client's comfort level in answering demographic questions. When enrolling a client who already has a record in HMIS, confirm that their race and ethnicity information is accurate and complete and up to date or update if needed. If a client identifies with a more specific ethnicity or cultural identity, record that information in the open text field. For example, Puerto Rican, Cuban, etc. Race and ethnicity common errors. Entering guesses based on appearance, name, or other assumptions. Limiting the client's choice, or only asking about one race or ethnicity, even if they identify with more than one. Leaving old or incomplete race and ethnicity information in HMIS when enrolling a client who already has a record. Entering a race or ethnicity value and simultaneously marking client doesn't know or client prefers not to answer. Failing to record more specific ethnic or cultural identifiers the client provides. Example, Puerto Rican or Haitian. Veteran status. Veteran status data allows for an accurate count of how many veterans experience homelessness and possibly eligible for veteran services. The veteran status field will populate on the profile creation screen for any adult clients. The veteran status field would only populate on the screen once a date of birth of 18 years or older is entered. This data is useful for screening for possible housing and service interventions and for gaining an understanding of veteran service needs. These are the available response descriptions available when entering a veteran status. This data element is only required for adults, clients, and when a client turns 18 while enrolled in a program. The client's veteran status, along with other data elements such as income, should be reviewed and collected when the client ages into adulthood. Veteran status collection best practices. Veteran status is not dependent on discharge status. Asking additional questions may result in more accurate information, as some clients may not be aware that they are considered veterans. Have you ever been on active duty in the military? Were you disabled during a period of active duty training? Were you ever called into active duty as a member of the National Guard or as a reservist? As always, if using an existing client record, the user should ask the client to confirm the information already recorded and make corrections or additions as needed. Veteran status collection common errors. Not checking a client's previous HMIS record and overwriting or leaving incorrect veteran status information. Marking no because the client is not eligible for certain VA benefits, even though they served in the armed forces. Creating multiple conflicting entries across different enrollments instead of maintaining one record per client. Selecting client doesn't know or client prefers not to answer when the client actually provided an answer. Selecting data not collected when the client was asked. Failing to ask about service in the National Guard, reserves, or active duty training, which can lead to underreporting. Missing an opportunity to collect veteran status when a client reaches adulthood during enrollment. And we will now be presenting a demo for profile elements. Please just give me a moment to get my screen ready. Today, we're going to talk about some of the most common errors we see when collecting client data in HMIS and how to avoid them. Accurate data is essential for tracking services, preventing duplicate records, and ensuring clients receive the benefits that they're eligible for. We'll go through errors by key data elements: name, social security number, date of birth, race and ethnicity, and veteran status. Starting with name collection. One of the most common mistakes we see is not verifying an existing name in HMIS when the client already has a record. Always check before creating a record because the duplicate records often happen due to a minor spelling difference or variations in how names are entered. In this example, we will look for our client Gandalf using the first 3 letters of the first and last name. As you can see, a list of clients will populate. Make sure that you're utilizing all resources to check for the client's profile. So for example, Gandalf the Grey, we're going to verify the date of birth and social security number matches. Once you have found your client, you can go ahead and click their profile. Once in their profile, you can go ahead and go to the Files tab. In the Files tab, you will see that the client has a personal identification state ID uploaded. Since this is fictitious information, you will not see the client's information, but we'll just say that this is Gandalf's ID card. If you are unable to find your client and you need to create a new client profile, you can go ahead and create a new profile, selecting Add a New Client. I have already pre-filled some of the information for our training. Just to review different scenarios. A key reminder is that users will be required to enter their first and last name and select the appropriate data quality indicator. A frequent error that we see is entering a client's preferred name when the client actually identifies with a different name. For our example, the client's first name he gave us was Gandhi, which is the client's partial name, street name, or code name. For that example, the quality of name would be partial, street name, or code name reported. If the client was not asked for their name during intake, the quality of name would be data not collected. If the client doesn't know, the staff member can create a made-up or placeholder name, such as blue hat or gray beard, and the quality of name would be client doesn't know. We also see users entering nicknames, code names, or placeholder names and never updating them once the client's real name or preferred name is known. We want to make it a practice to update records over time because accuracy grows as you engage with the client. Accurate names prevent confusion and make HMIS searches more effective. Social security numbers. Social security numbers are critical for identifying clients uniquely. One common error is failing to check whether a social security number already exists in HMIS. Always verify and confirm the number with the client. Typing errors are another issue, so read back the number to ensure accuracy. Do not change your full 9-digit social security number to only the last 4 digits unless the client requests. Remember to document the correct data quality. Whether the client doesn't know, prefers not to answer, or if it was not collected, don't rely on placeholder numbers like 9999999. For example, I'll go ahead and type that social security number in. you will see that we get a pop-up that states that the Social Security number entered does not conform to a Social Security Administration guideline. You can click Cancel to change the Social Security number, or click OK to proceed with the Social Security number entered. For our example, we'll go ahead and select Cancel so we can go through a different scenario. When completing the Social Security number field, users may also enter non-numeric numbers for parts of a Social Security number that is unknown or refused by a client. For example, we'll say that the client did not know the first 5 numbers of their Social Security number, and we'll go ahead and select these X's. As you can see, the quality of Social Security number will change to approximate or partial Social Security number reported. However, if a non-numeric character is changed for all 9 digits of the Social Security number, the Social Security number field defaults to client doesn't know. Finally, if you only collect partial Social Security numbers at first, make sure to update the record when the full Social Security number becomes available. Use the Social Security number along with the name and date of birth to avoid duplicate records.
Michaela, if I could share a note.
Sure.
Thank you. As Michaela mentioned in the previous slides and in the demo, when you enter in all access, the system will default to the data of SSN to client doesn't know, but you will need to take an extra step to verify the status of the outcome. So if the client doesn't know or was unable to provide, that status can remain client doesn't know. But if the client at the time did not prefer not providing the answer, then you would have to update the quality of SSN to that status. And for in cases where the staff was not able to make attempt to collect that, you would update it to data not collected. So while the system does default to the first status, users do need to take that extra step and verify the quality of the SSN and update the status to appropriately reflect that data collection outcome. Thank you, Michaela.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Moving forward with date of birth. Common date of birth errors include entering an incorrect date or making typos in the month, day, or year. If possible, add proof of the date of birth, like a birth certificate or ID, to the record. For our example, our client did not provide us their date on their date of birth. If an estimated date of birth is used, like our example, you would select 1 or enter in 1 and always mark it as approximate. Avoid selecting client doesn't know, client prefers not to answer if the client actually provides their full date of birth, and never enter in guesses or placeholders without documentation. Moving forward with race and ethnicity. Race and ethnicity should always be reported as the client identifies, not based off of staff assumptions. Do not guess based on appearance, name, or other assumptions, and clients are able to select multiple options. Ask about all the races and ethnicities the client identifies with, and update old or incomplete information when entering returning clients. Avoid marking race and ethnicity value while also selecting client doesn't know. For example, if we were to select these 3 and then client doesn't know, it would automatically uncheck the first 3 that were selected, and the only option left is client doesn't know. Finally, capture more specific cultural identifiers when provided an example in additional race and ethnicity detail. Puerto Rican or Haitian, for our example, we'll use Filipino, and just so that it reflects the data, the client's self-identification accurately. Last but not least, we have veteran status. Common veteran status errors include overwriting or leaving incorrect information from previous records. So you want to make sure that you always check the client's existing record first. Do not mark no just because the client is not eligible for a certain VA benefit that they may have served in the armed forces. Once you have selected yes, you will have an additional drop-down with veteran information. Avoid conflicting entries across multiple enrollments. Each client should have one consistent record. Be sure to ask about the service in the National Guard, reserves, or active duty training, and update records if a client reaches adulthood during enrollment. Never mark client doesn't know or data not collected if the client actually provided an answer. Accurate HMIS data depends on attention to detail, careful verification, and uploading records over time. Always confirm names, social security numbers, and date of births. Use client preferred information when possible. Document reasons for missing or unknown data, and update placeholder or partial data as you learn more. By following these practices, we prevent duplicates, improve reporting, and help clients access the services that they need. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Michaela. I'll go ahead and share my screen. Good afternoon again, everyone. For this next portion of the training, we'll review the prior living situation data element. While not a profile screen question, we wanted to cover these fields today to address some of the common questions and errors our team sees around this very nuanced data element. Anyone who has completed an enrollment in the past will have encountered the prior living situation questions. Prior living situation data is used to identify the type of living situation and length of stay in that situation immediately prior to the project start for all adults and head of households. These questions are used to determine project eligibility, chronic homeless status, and prioritization for clients enrolled in the coordinated entry project. Users can locate information about the prior living situation data element by navigating to 3.917 of the HMIS Data Standards Manual or review the prior living situation knowledge base articles from ochmis.org. The prior living situation data element is composed of a series of questions on the entry screen, as seen to the right. The two initial questions are type of residence, which refers to the type of living situation the client stayed in on the night prior to entry, and length of stay in prior living situation, which refers to the number of consecutive nights spent in that situation leading up to and including the night before project entry. Projects that do not require a homeless status at entry, such as homeless prevention, may not see all the response constraint fields covered during this review of the prior living situation data element. The HMIS team would like to note that errors on the entry screen can result in greater impacts on the COC as a whole, including the COC's competitiveness for future funding. Examples include poor scoring on entries from literal homelessness for applicable projects, such as permanent housing or street outreach. These projects require a literal homelessness situation reported for the type of residence question 100% of the time. Errors occur when a non-homeless situation is entered instead. Another example is extremely long lengths of homelessness. This can occur to data collection errors for the client's approximate date that the current episode of homelessness started. Additionally, missing, incomplete, or inaccurate prior living situation data can lead to an underreporting of chronic homelessness in the community and for heads of household. This can also impact coordinated entry prioritization. Finally, data errors may occur due to outdated cascading data. This happens when data from the previous enrollment automatically appears on the entry screen of the next enrollment that's opened, even between different projects and agencies. For today's discussion, I will be reviewing each of the questions that may appear under the prior living situation section. We will cover what each of the questions are intended to collect, as well as highlight best practices, and discuss common data collection errors that connect back to the errors I've just highlighted. Type of resonance. For the type of resonance question, staff will need to work with the client to identify a living situation that best describes where they stayed the night prior to project intake. HUD uses type of resonance data to assess the types of living situations clients are entering from for each project type. Further guidance and response descriptions for the type of resonance question are available from the HMIS Data Standards Manual and OCHMIS's Type of Resonance Knowledge Base article. Some common errors for a type of resonance field include reporting where the client stayed on the day the information was collected. The type of resonance question reflects the living situation type for the night prior to program enrollment. Another error includes reporting where the client stayed when they were last housed due to phrasing like, "What was your last type of residence?" or "Where did you last stay?" The framing of those questions may not be targeted enough to capture where the client stayed the night prior to project entry. Following the type of resonance question, staff will then ask the client about their length of stay in that type of residence. For this field, the staff will record the number of days, weeks, or months in a row the client stayed in that living situation leading up to and including the night prior to intake. Select the field that most closely aligns with the client's self-reported experience. This data element can be a bit wily, so let's explore some examples based on commonly reported entry data. In example A, the client reported that their prior living situation was a place not meant for human habitation. You can find the intake marker and know that they stayed at a park the night prior to intake. You can also see that they moved around from one outdoor space to another for a span of about 11 months in total, leading up to the night before intake. The intake staff would report 11 months as 90 days or more, but less than 1 year for the client's length of stay. In other scenarios, the client moves around from one living situation type to another and then another. For these situations, the staff would only report the length of time for the place the client reported as their type of residence. I know this is a little bit confusing, but let's break it down a little bit further. In example B, the client moved from the park to a hospital and then back to the park until intake. They have moved between two different type of living situations. Because they stayed at a park the night before intake, their type of residence was reported as place not meant for human habitation. To calculate the length of stay in a place not meant for human habitation, the intake staff would ask the client how many nights in a row the client stayed at the park after they left the hospital and leading all the way up to and including the night before intake. The client most recently left the hospital in about October and stayed in the park until the night prior to intake in March for a total of 6 months. This is the client's length of stay for the prior residence. I encourage users to familiarize themselves with the different homelessness categories as it can be confusing on the best of days. So for this example, we've had the client moving in example B between the hospital and park. Staff would need to be aware of what it counts as a literal homelessness situation versus a non-literal homelessness situation. Length of stay common errors. Some length of stay common errors that our COC sees include instances where the length of stay reported does not reflect the total time spent in that living situation. For example, an error could occur if the intake staff only count the most recent park stay for the client that moved between the park to a church and then back to the park. These are all literal homelessness situations and should all be counted as one length of stay. Another error includes instances where the total length of stay reflects the total time the client has been homeless when the client has reported multiple types of living situations. In the bottom example, again, we would only want the most recent living situation to be reported, and then we're going to record the length of stay for that most recent living situation. For all projects other than street outreach, emergency shelter, or safe haven, Clarity has built-in logic that populates the approximate date this episode of homelessness started if responses to the type of residence and length of stay questions indicate literal homelessness. In the example to the right at the top, the client reports a type of residence as a place not meant for habitation. This is a literal homeless living situation, a response that automatically triggers the approximate date this episode of homelessness started question to appear. Anytime a non-literal or an institutional type of residence is selected, there will be additional length of stay questions to confirm whether the length of stay was less than 7 nights for non-literal situations, and whether the length of stay was less than 90 days for institutional settings. And in both cases, whether the client was experiencing literal homelessness on the night prior to project entry. For the example at the bottom, the client reports staying at a residential project with no homeless criteria. Their length of stay was less than 7 nights, and they stayed on the street, in emergency shelter or safe haven, the night prior to project entry. Thus, the approximate date this episode of homelessness field has populated. As I mentioned previously, street outreach, emergency shelter, and safe haven projects will have entry screens that always include the approximate date this episode of homelessness started. All other project entry screens will have the built-in logic that only populates the date field when responses indicate the person was experiencing literal homelessness the night prior to intake. Users can review the HMIS Data Standards Manual, prior living situation flowchart to understand the response pathway and see the responses that triggered the additional prior living situation fields to populate. As previously stated, the approximate date the current episode of homelessness started question represents the start date of the client's current episode of homelessness. For further guidance about this field, review the HMIS Data Standards Prior Living Situation Data element. You can also review the approximate date homelessness started knowledge base article from ochmis.org. To complete the approximate date this episode of homelessness started field, enter the client's self-reported current episode start date. The Clarity system will not allow users to save the page without a response for that field. So if the client does not know the exact date they became homeless most recently, but does recall the month and year, it is absolutely acceptable to use the first day of the month as the start date of their current episode of homelessness. For example, the full date at the top would be May 14, 2020, but if the participant didn't know the exact day they became homeless in May of 2020, the user can enter May 1st, 2020. Some common errors for the approximate date the current episode began include entering the project start date into the field without asking the client about their homeless history, entering a temporary or placeholder date without going back later to update the field with a more accurate date, failing to review entry screen responses that have auto-populated due to enrollment cascading. Again, always review auto-populated information with the client and update information as needed. In addition to the start date for the current episode, users will also record the number of unique episodes that occurred and the total number of months the client spent homeless during those episodes over the past 3 years. This is captured by the question that asks for the number of times on the streets, in emergency shelter, or safe haven in the past 3 years. These questions are used along with the start date of the current episode to partially determine if the client meets HUD's definition of chronic homelessness. While the wording is confusing, the number of times on the streets, in emergency shelter, or safe haven in the past 3 years question is intended to record the number of unique episodes of homelessness the client has experienced in the past 3 years. Next, the user will then record the total number of months the client spent homeless on the streets, in emergency shelter, or safe haven for each of those past episodes in the last 3 years. If the client has experienced 12 or more consecutive months of homelessness in the past 3 years, or has had 4 or more episodes over the past 3 years that total up to 12 months or more, the client meets some of the definition of chronic homelessness, the other requirement being that the person must have a disabling condition. The disabling condition questions seen on the project entry screen will be covered in more detail in a future training. Some common data collection errors for the number and length of episodes in the past 3 years include reporting multiple episodes in the past 3 years, but the current episode reported started more than 3 years ago. If more than one episode was reported in the past 3 years, that means the current episode must have occurred sometime in the past 3 years. Another common mistake we see is that when users plug in the number of emergency shelter stays as the number of episodes in the past 3 years. But those emergency shelter stays don't represent new episodes of homelessness in the past 3 years, so that would not be accurate. Again, that kind of ties back to the wording that HUD uses for the question. It is best to ask the question in the frame of how many times did the client fall into homelessness in the past 3 years that resulted in them staying on the street, in emergency shelter, or in a safe haven. Let's review some prior living situation best practices. These include explaining the purpose of your questions to the client and use plain language. Avoid simply reading the questions verbatim from the screen. Staff are encouraged to practice presenting the entry questions to gain confidence with collecting accurate prior living situation data. While staff may select client doesn't know or client prefers not to answer, when the client in fact cannot remember or does not want to provide a response for the prior living situation questions, these entries can impact program eligibility and possibly prioritization for the coordinated entry system. Avoid selecting data not collected, and if selected, do try to collect the missing data as soon as possible. Review program intake information that happens to cascade from a previous enrollment and ask the client if this is still accurate. And finally, become familiar with the different categories of homelessness and what distinguishes a break from an episode. You can review HUD's categories of homelessness page for those definitions. Now that we've reviewed the different prior living situation questions, I'd like to walk us through a sample conversation as a demonstration of how staff may pose the prior living situation to clients in order to collect the accurate data. For our conversation, I'll be playing both roles, and the scenario is an intake worker completing the prior living situation questions with Gandalf the Grey. I encourage you to follow along by writing down or taking note of key pieces of information that you would collect and enter into the prior living situation fields for Gandalf's enrollment. Let's get started. Hi, Gandalf. To enroll you in our program, I need to ask you some questions about your history of experiencing homelessness. These questions will help us determine your chronic homeless status and eligibility for certain assistance. Gandalf says, "Okay, thank you." So we can proceed. First question, where did you stay or sleep last night? Gandalf replies, "I stayed in Huntington Beach behind a church. I usually sleep at a friend's or behind the couch." Let's pause and take note of the information so far. We know that Gandalf stayed outdoors behind a church last night, and when they are not sleeping there, they stay with a friend. At this point, we know where Gandalf stayed last night, but we don't know how long they've been staying there or when their current episode of homelessness began. So let's continue on to find out. Okay, since you last left your friends, do you know how many nights in a row you have stayed or slept behind the church leading up to last night? Gandalf replies, "A little over a week this time." Great. Now we know Gandalf's approximate length of stay in their prior place of residence, which is just over a week. Now we need to ask Gandalf about their current episode and when that began. Do you know the date when you most recently became homeless? If you don't remember the exact date, the month and year will work too. Gandalf says, "I remember the date. It was May 14th, 2020. Now we know the approximate date Gandalf's current episode of homelessness began. May 14th, 2020. But we'll also need to know how many episodes and months of homelessness that Gandalf has experienced in the past 3 years. So let's ask. Gandalf, have you spent the night anywhere indoors since May of 2020? This could be with friends or family, at a hotel, a hospital, or any other location. And Gandalf replies, "I have just stayed with my friend on and off when I can." Note that Gandalf has stayed in a non-literal living situation at their friend's place, on and off over the past 3 years. So if Gandalf has had any stays at their friends that lasted 7 nights or more, those would be recorded as breaks in homelessness, potentially followed by a new episode once they left and went back to staying outdoors. Let's find out if Gandalf recalls staying at their friend's place for 7 nights or more at any point in the last 3 years. Gandalf, do you remember the date or month year you last stayed with your friend for more than a week? Gandalf replies, "I used to rent a room until May of 2020, when I became homeless. From then on, I could only stay with my friend for 2 or 3 days at a time." From the information Gandalf has provided, we know that they did not have a break in their current single episode of homelessness that started on May 14th, 2020. Here is a visual representation of Gandalf's homeless history. We know the onset of homelessness started in May of 2020 with occasional 2 to 3 night stays on a friend's couch or behind a church building. Thus, Gandalf has only had one continuous episode of homelessness, totaling 12 months or more. Now that we've collected responses for the prior living situation questions, let's practice entering the information into the Clarity system based on the responses provided by Gandalf. As I mentioned today for our demonstration, we'll be navigating directly to Gandalf's enrollment screen, but best practices is always to search for an existing client record or an existing project enrollment before opening any new records or enrollments. So let's get started. To record Gandalf's prior living situation information, I'll open up a new project enrollment and navigate to the prior living situation questions. From my conversation with Gandalf, I know that they spent the night prior outdoors behind a church. To record this, I'll select from the drop-down, place not meant for human habitation because they slept outdoors. A friendly reminder that if you are not sure how to categorize the type of residence based on the client's information, you can always review Appendix A of the HMIS data standards, which lists each of these options and their descriptions. Next, I'll plug in the length of stay in the prior living situation. Gandalf reported staying behind the church for a little over a week. I'll record this response as 1 week or more, but less than 1 month. At this point, you'll notice that some extra questions have appeared. The approximate date this episode of homelessness started and the number and length of episodes in the past 3 years questions will only populate for projects if the responses entered into the type of residence and length of stay fields happen to indicate that the client is experiencing literal homelessness. Unless you are enrolling clients in street outreach, emergency shelter, or safe haven, in which case those 3 fields, approximate date of homelessness and the number of times and months, those questions will always appear on the screen for street outreach, emergency shelter, or safe haven. During my conversation with Gandalf, I confirmed that their current episode of homelessness began on May 14th, 2020. I could plug that date into the approximate date the current episode of homelessness started field. A friendly reminder that if the client doesn't recall the specific date, you may use the first day of the month of the year that they provide. These next 2 questions, number of times on the streets emergency shelter or safe haven in the past 3 years, and the total number of months on the streets in emergency shelter or safe haven in the past 3 years, are intended to capture the number of episodes that occurred in the past 3 years, as well as the total number of months the client spent homeless during any of those episodes in the past 3 years. Gandalf reported having 1 continuous episode of homelessness in the past 3 years, totaling for 12 months or more. So from the number of times on the streets, emergency shelter, or safe haven, I will select 1 time. And for the total number of months since they've been homeless continuously since 2020, that is definitely going to be more than 12 months. At this point, I want to highlight a few of the most common errors we see for the prior living situation questions. First, type of residence. Sometimes we see folks enrolled in street outreach or permanent housing projects that report entering from a house situation, such as renting or owning. We know that those project types require that 100% of entries be from literal homelessness situations, meaning they stayed on the street, in emergency shelter, or safe haven the night prior to intake. Again, we highly recommend using phrasing such as, "Where did you stay last night?" in order to get a more accurate response. Next, extremely long lengths of homelessness for the current episode. This is not always an error. We do know that, in fact, folks are unfortunately experiencing sometimes decades of homelessness, and a lot can happen in that time. With someone being in survival mode, their concern is not going to be thinking about whether or not they meet eligibility requirements or maintaining their chronic homeless status. So our job is to help the client look back at the past few years and think about where they stayed and for how long. You may initially enter the client's self-reported date, but if during the course of engagement and completing third-party verification, it becomes clear that there may be a more recent start date for their current episode, staff can and should go in and update the approximate date the current episode began. Last, I'll highlight these fields down here, specifically the number of times on the streets, an emergency shelter, or a safe haven in the past 3 years. The wording on this question is very confusing, so please, if you can, don't read it verbatim to the client. Contrary to how it's written, this is not actually asking for the total number of times they went and stayed in emergency shelter on the street. This question is asking for the number of new episodes that occurred in the past 3 years that resulted in the person having to go into one of those three places. This would be the number of episodes that occurred in the past 3 years. If they report more than one episode in the past 3 years, for example, if I change this to 4 or more times, that means their current episode must have started sometime in the past 3 years. They've had 4 or more episodes in the past 3 years. Their current episode had to have started sometime in the past 3 years. So if the approximate date the current episode started was initially reported as more than 3 years ago, as is in the case of Gandalf here, that is an error. We need to do one of two things. More often than not, this error occurs because of a misunderstanding of the question. So if the current start date of the episode did begin more than 3 years ago, we'll leave that alone. If we know Gandalf started their current episode of homelessness in May of 2020, and that is absolutely true, we'll go ahead and select one time because we know they've had one unbroken episode of homelessness. We're assuming that that question response was probably misunderstood. They did not have any new episodes of homelessness in the past 3 years. However, if they have determined that they've had more than one episode in the past 3 years, and this date here still reflects a date older than 3 years, and we have verification that indicates they have a more current start date of their homelessness that occurred in the last 3 years, we do want to go in and update to that new start date for the current episode of homelessness. Finally, I just want to hammer home one more time. If their approximate date this episode of homelessness started is longer than 3 years ago, the number of times on the streets, in emergency shelter, or safe haven in the past 3 years must be 1. If it's not, there's an error somewhere in there. We got to figure out what it is. And that concludes our demonstration, and I'll move us back to conclude the rest of our training. We'll continue on with recapping what we've discussed so far. Here is a snapshot of what each of the fields under the prior living situation are intended to capture. For the type of residence, again, we're looking for the type of place that they slept last night, the night prior to intake. For the length of stay in the prior living situation, we're recording the length of time they stayed in that situation leading up to and including the night before intake. For the approximate date the current episode of homelessness started, we are going to record the start date of their current episode. And for the number of times on the streets, in emergency shelter, in safe haven, in the last 3 years, record the number of episodes that occurred in the past 3 years. And then total and record the number of months the participant has spent homeless for each of those episodes over the past 3 years. And again, a friendly reminder to be mindful of enrollment information that auto-populates on the screen due to enrollment cascading. Always review the information with the client and make sure that information stays up to date. Make corrections as needed. Do your best not to enter the response of data not collected whenever possible. But if you do, because you're not able to collect that information, do be mindful to go back and complete the missing information. To wrap up our discussion of the data elements we reviewed today, we will now ask for your participation in a quick poll. Your responses will help guide and develop our content for future data element trainings. So if you can participate, we ask that you open a browser on your desktop or tablet or phone and navigate to menti.com. You'll need to pause and wait for me to share the code or QR scan code in order to join the poll. So when I do that, I'll let you know. You could plug that information in and we'll get started. And then after the poll concludes, we'll review some of those responses. All right. On my screen, should be seeing the Mentimeter poll for the first question. If you can all verify for me that you're able to see that information, I do see that some folks are already responding. It's fantastic. The first question is, how do you collect the client profile data? And these are all going to be word cloud responses, so there's no right or wrong answer here. This is all based on your personal experience and preferences. We're just curious to know. It seems like asking the client is the clear contender so far. We'll give it just another minute or so. All right, it seems like responses are slowing down a bit. Let me give it one more second and we'll move on to our next question. All right. We'll go ahead and move on to our next question. I'm so sorry if I'm cutting you off. Next question, how do you all collect information for the approximate date this episode of homelessness started field from the client? Seems like folks are thinking about the answer. I like the person who responded, break down the question, rephrasing the question. Nearest date the client can remember. Program history can be helpful. Okay, it looks like responses are slowing down for this question, so we'll proceed to the next one. All right, this is a knowledge-based question. So which response is considered as missing data for client profile data collection? Client doesn't know, client prefers not to answer, data not collected, or all of the responses? Which response is considered missing data? Okay. Seems like most of the respondents so far have listed data not collected. We're slowing down, so we'll go ahead and continue on to the next question. Another knowledge-based question. Type of residence equates to place where the client last slept. Place where the client slept last night. Or stayed. You can frame that as place where the client stayed last night. True or false, or I'm not sure. Type of residence equals the place where the client slept, or stayed the night before intake. True, false, or not sure. All right. Thank you for your responses so far. And if you said, I'm not sure, that's an absolute valid response too. All right, moving on to the next question. On the entry screen, you'll see number of times on the streets, an emergency shelter, or safe haven in the past 3 years. Does that equal the number of homeless episodes in the past 3 years? True or false? All right. The majority of you all so far have indicated true, which is fantastic. And I'm sorry to cut you all off, but we'll go ahead and conclude our poll here. So if you want to make one final guess before we close the poll, feel free to do that now. All right, we're going to conclude this. That's the end of our presentation for the poll. And we're just going to take that information. Thank you very much. And we'll share the results of those polls down the line. As I mentioned, it's going to be used to craft further trainings on our data collection for our data elements. I'm going to use the remainder of our time because I know we're reaching the end of our hour and a half to open it up for the Q&A portion of our meeting. Allow me just a moment to share my screen once again, and we'll go back to the slides, but do feel free. We're going to moderate using the Q&A button on the toolbar of your Zoom. So if you have a question, do plug it in there. And thank you, Elizabeth. Elizabeth has posted a link in the chat. We do have a non a training survey that's not a quiz. This is our basic training survey that we offer after every user meeting and training, just to provide your feedback about your experience and ways that we can improve and provide more tailored information for our community during future trainings. So now we are officially moved into our Q&A portion of our meeting for the remainder of our time.
Amy, we had a few questions regarding client self-reported approximate date, as well as if staff is able to collect documentation in the future. They're asking which date should they be using. The guidance, as Amy mentioned, is to have a discussion with the client and help create that timeline and have the client provide their homeless history and verify that information. But Amy, I'll pass it over to you to share additional notes.
I thank you, Elizabeth. Yes, Elizabeth is correct. We want to use the self-reported client information. Many of our projects require entries from literal homelessness. So at the time of enrollment, typically there's a request to collect third-party verification. So if you're not seeing those two things line up, it's definitely worth having a conversation with the client. looking maybe at enrollment history and a previously uploaded documentation to see if there's a more current episode of homelessness that can be verified. Because if there's contradictions, we want to know what might have occurred over the course of their experiencing homelessness. So if you do have documented third-party verification, for example, for the coordinated entry system, where third-party verification may be used to support their prioritization, you know that they do in fact have a more current recent length of homelessness, you should go back in and update that. So oftentimes we see as a placeholder the clients and first time that they became homeless was in 1990, and that may be true, but that's a long length of time. So if there's information that kind of points to there being a more current episode of homelessness that started a little bit sooner, for example, if you see the participant had an enrollment in a permanent housing project and there was a move-in date, but they're reporting that they became homeless in 1990, but the move-in date happened in 2025, you know that you likely need to go in and adjust the start date of their current episode to 2025. So it's looking for clues like that in enrollment history and third-party verification. You're not trying to dispute what the client is saying. We're not trying to make them or force them to prove their length of homelessness. But if there are extremely long lengths of homelessness, again, it's really valuable to carefully ask questions of a client. Where have you stayed that might have been indoors, in the past few years that you can remember? How long were those stays and where did they occur? And from there, you can go in and determine if there were breaks in homelessness that were followed by new episodes sometime in the recent history. So that would be an example where if there was a break and a new episode of homelessness that occurred more recently, you do need to go back in and adjust the start date of their current episode because that is what has accurately happened. And just a friendly reminder that we will be recording the questions, as well as this webinar, the slides, and any of the links that were included on the slide as materials will be posted to the OCHMIS website under meeting materials in due time. We do plan to possibly host more future webinars on collecting data elements for both universal data elements and project specific data elements. So based on your feedback from the community and common tickets that we may see, we may host future trainings like this in the near future. But please stand by, give us some time to kind of collect all the Q&A questions and compile the materials, and we'll post that to our website for your use. I'm seeing a question stating, if the client states they are on day 2 of staying at a friend's house, what question would I ask about the episode of homelessness? For that question, it's a little bit tricky. If they're currently staying at a friend's place, I would say go back and reassess after they've reached that 7th day mark. If they're still staying at their friend's place, that would be considered a break in their homelessness. At the point of project enrollment, if they're only on day 2 of staying at a friend's, you would just indicate that they are staying at a friend's place. The subsequent questions that will populate on the screen will ask if it's less than 7 nights and if are going to be spending the night homeless at the time of entry. So they will be experiencing literal homelessness for the purposes of your project. So again, if things change, you do need to be mindful to go back in and complete the data to update it more accurately reflect the client situation. If they break their homelessness during enrollment, there may need to be a conversation about program eligibility or perhaps continuing on and staying, is there a place, where you plan to stay after you leave your friends and then reconnect with them at that time if they need additional services? Thank you, everyone. We're a minute over our allotted time for this training. If you have any last minute questions, feel free to add them to the Q&A. We may not be able to verbally address them during our meeting time today, but we will follow up with any last minute questions. As I previously stated, because we are recording this Q&A session, we'll capture all those questions and the responses and include that with the meeting materials. I don't see any additional questions. So with that, I thank everybody for their time. Thank you for your patience, and we will see you in the ticketing system, and we'll see you at future user meetings and at future trainings. So thank you. Have a wonderful day.